Jeremy, we have been talking off mic and in the cafe for about 20 minutes now, and something that you said, which really made my ears prick up, was that you sit before me as a proud Aboriginal man today. However, you grew up what you considered to be Pacific Islander or Māori. Let's start with that. Let's start with childhood.
I think the influences of my young life were all based around Māori and Pacific Island community. And so, you know, it started, I lived on the northern beaches of Sydney as a young boy, which was, it was heavily, what people don't realise, it's quite a very privileged white area, but there was a very large Pacific Island population. And that was where I fit in, you know, because I didn't look like the blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids that were at Manly Beach Surf Club. I didn't belong to them. And so therefore you have to find a place of belonging. And my place of belonging sat within the Polynesian community or the Pacific Island community. And then mum and dad, you know, who I was spending the majority of my time living with, were from NZ and from, you know, mum with a, you know, very big family, a Samoan family. And so that became my identity. And it's where I never had to, I think one of the things with being whāngai'd Māori, or this understanding of whāngai'd, which is a really beautiful concept, because every other word I've come across traveling around the world, or especially here in this country, says you're either fostered, you're adopted, which all of those words mean you didn't belong to where you were. Whereas the word whāngai'd gives you a place in a cultural setting. Mm-hmm. And so irrespective of knowing that, yeah, they're not your biological parents, it gives you a place in that family structure. And it's a really heavily acknowledged word, you know, through the Māori culture. And so the one thing I realized was I never had to explain, or why do you have olive skin, or what, you know, where do you come from, you know? So when I was Māori, I was just Māori, you know, and even to the point where still today, like I walk, you know, into, if I go to New Zealand and the Māori people greet, oh, che bro, like it's who I am. And I have this, and I spoke about it on stage the other day, is that the moment I'm around Māoris, my accent changes. I become really hoary in my languages. And I don't mean to, it's just the influence of how we grew up.
I also think it's the adaptability of survival, especially when you feel like you don't have an identity. Speaking from my own experience growing up Māori in Perth, Scarborough Beach, I was dyeing my hair peroxide blonde. I was trying to change my eyes to go blue. I was trying to change my last name, which I've never told anyone before, and it broke my dad's heart.
Yep.
And I think it's this survival technique.
I think cultural chameleons is one of the things that I speak a lot about, is that especially in the awareness of creating success, we have to be able to change the language we speak in constantly. And
wow.
You know, because I could, you know, go from sitting, you know, around the dinner table at home, you know, with a mixture of cultures where a lot of slang is used, to then jumping straight on a phone call and having to pitch you know, an artwork creation to the board of directors of Suncorp Bank, or, you know, all of a sudden, you know, so then I'm articulating something in a complete different language. And then I walk over here and I'm, you know, training with Māori. I'm at Nerang Rugby Union Club and it's predominantly Māori Pacific Islands. So my language is forever changing based around who I'm sitting with. And it is very much just a survival tool. Mm. It's who I became, and my grandfather, my father's father, articulated this the best to me. And he said, your gift will be your colored skin. And he wasn't talking about being black or white. He was talking about the fact that we were mixed colored and we would be able to walk between so many different cultures and never be able to be racially identified as you are this or you are that that you are able to talk to a greater mass because of our beigeness.
I think on the flip side, as we were saying, that also it feels like one of my biggest hurdles in life too. Because of that, not being brown or not being white, I feel extremely displaced, and I have since I was a child. Let's talk about you. Do you remember feeling displaced as a child, or is it until later years?
I hate that statement that ignorant, and I don't want to use, like, ignorant is such an aggressive word sometimes, but like the truth is, like, very benign ignorance. So ignorance that's not meant to hurt us actually is very hurtful. Like when they say, oh, are you part this? Are you part that? And all I just wanted to be was part of something. And that's the part that broke my heart, is that I didn't know where I came from. You know, so you put, you know, as a young boy, disconnected from identity, not knowing who I am, where I come from, all of a sudden I try and create a cultural identity which is not my own. And that was fraught with danger as well, because I remember finding out, I was 13, I was at Bangarra Children's Court in Glebe, when I discovered and learnt that I was not Māori, that I was, in fact, that I was Aboriginal. And, you know, my only reference point to being Aboriginal was, or of an Aboriginal person, was of negative context. And so now, all of a sudden, Māori are very, like, the way I saw Māori people was very proud. You know, they were connected to culture. That, you know, sure, tragically, you know, people of, you know, our parents' age, you know, had the language taken away, and if they left New Zealand, they were, you know, fractured their relationship to their whānau and to their connection that existed there. But they were proud, and there was always, you know, aspects of Māori cultures in the houses that we were visiting, but I had no reference point. I was really lost. What does this mean if now I'm not Māori? Who am I? And I'd spent 5 years of my young life, between 7 and 13, telling people I was Māori. And so now I'm not. Like, I'd lived a lie. And so this was a living, breathing lie that was unintentional and had unintentional consequences. And then to go before Bangarra Children's Court at 13 for the first time, which was just for vandalism.
I was going to ask, what was that for?
It was just vandalism, you know, and it was the first of my offences that would escalate, you know, from the time. And the escalation of my behaviour was based around my disconnection from identity. Well, who am I? Where do I belong? Who do I come from? What does it mean to be Aboriginal? And this was something that would take many years to discover the identity of who I am. And it really, I would have to say that my identity never started to solidify until I moved back to Cape York, or Southern Cape York, with my grandparents, my father's parents, when I was 18, you know, and this was on the back of, you know, addiction, like, well, I don't want to call that addiction back then. I want to call it abuse. Yeah. You know, so alcohol abuse. I want to call it you know, like, it was the party drugs. You know, we were in Sydney. Yeah. We learned that we could make money from selling speed, from selling ecstasy, from selling MDMA, from, you know, we were hustling, you know, we were doing whatever it took to survive. And, you know, there was, you know, we experimented with drugs, you know, like, we were, you know, in between, you know, for me, as, you know, I was finding out about my Aboriginal connection. So I went from the Northern Beaches to Redfern, you know, because that's where I'd find my place. You know, after being incarcerated as a juvenile for the first time, I had connection to community, which was based in Redfern. So that became, Redfern and Waterloo became the pathway. But then I would also have this connection to the Northern Beaches of Sydney, you know, which is polar opposites at that time. You know, in the early 90s, you know, when you know, sort of poverty and violence and abuse was at its heights in Redfern. You know, there was, you know, the heroin epidemic that was existing. You know, we were experimenting with everything. It wasn't just alcohol, but and weed as the precursor. You know, like, we were, you know, there was, you know, the heroin that was being spotted everywhere. You know, at that point. And then, you know, and then the party drugs and the scene came in. And then for me, I guess, ever the entrepreneur, I realized if I played with drugs, I could make money. And that's was always the narrative for me. It was not in my young life. It was a drug abuse versus an addiction.
Yeah.
And the abuse was based around making money and just constantly, how do I make money to survive? At 21, when I came back to Sydney after being a couple of years away from the city, and I came back to Sydney with Bangarra, with the Aboriginal Dance Company, and I was very much staunchly ingrained into, inside my culture then. And Bangarra was this incredible institute of cultural dance that was mixing, contemporary ballet and jazz, and, but it was fraught with danger too, because, inside of that, you were mixing culture and party. And that became a volatile place for me because I just wanted culture. I'd gone from being with my grandparents where I was on a dirt floor, ochre and ceremony was incredibly culturally rich, to now, on a stage under lights, and culture was being performed for entertainment versus for a way of life. And then I knew how to make money. At 21 years old, like, if you've got a criminal record in Sydney and all you're good at is art, graffiti, and music, the didgeridoo, I'm not very employable. So therefore, I'm going to make money any way I can, and I had a network of people that would buy drugs, and from the dance scene, like the Bangarra scene, there was a lot of gay, interaction, like, so a lot of the dancers were gay that we were performing with, they wanted drugs, they paid bills, they didn't tick things up, it wasn't like Alfano that, they wanted stuff for nothing, It really, I worked out how to make money. And the other thing was, like this, the, women as well, the gay men were surrounded by beautiful women. And so that became the precursor to, another part of, addiction as well.
Jeremy, can I ask, was there any blackfella mentors or anyone who you looked up to, or was it sort of, this is what everyone else does, is, dabble with culture, dabble with party drugs, do drugs, sell drugs? Was that the only sort of influence you had?
Yeah, it was, like, because even the people that were culturally strong through the week was still drinking all weekend. And that to me was really challenging, was, how can you advocate this 5 days a week, but then be this for 2 days a week? I mean, I grew up at the same time, like you had, the likes of like Choc, Anthony Mundine, you had Wesi Patton, you had like some really beautiful people that were, coming out of the block. And I look at Choc as like one of the bravest and most disciplined people I've ever come across in my life, because to be surrounded by the amount of drugs that we were surrounded by at that age, and for him never to partake in, not even picking up a cigarette, I think is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Irrespective of, sort of, it's got nothing to do with belief systems or anything. It's just simply to do with a young man that was so disciplined to be the best at whatever he put his mind to. I admire him for that. And there were very few of us in that time that could have ever had that discipline. Because leadership didn't exist. I mean, Choc was right. Like, Uncle Tony Mundine was, and that whole, family were incredible leaders in the community. But Uncle Tony, was a very healthy man, very fit, always training, very disciplined. And Choc got that discipline. We didn't get that discipline. Our life was about making money, was, survival.
I want to ask something, because I've heard you talk about this on another podcast, is the absence of love throughout your childhood.
Yeah, love is it's a really challenging one, because what does that mean? Like, I feel like love is innately in us from the time we're born, but it needs to be developed. And if it's not developed and nurtured, then it disappears. And I think that's, one of the things that I really acutely recognize is that I was forever desperate just to be loved. And even the most in the most vulnerable way, at 46 years old, and like at 6'1", 100 kilos, I'm still desperate to be loved. And it's one of those things that sometimes I feel like a dissatisfaction, because the way I love people is so deeply, and when I don't feel it's reciprocated in the way that I love people, I get frustrated and annoyed because I feel like, why don't they love me the way I love them? But I've got to come to terms with the fact that not everyone loves like us. Not everyone loves like me, and even my kids, I love my kids so much. Like my kids are, they're absolutely my world, but I get let down because I feel like, shit, like I do so much. And sometimes I don't feel like it's the reciprocity is there. And that's not true. It's just, they don't show it the same way, I show it. And so therefore I feel like maybe they don't appreciate me. Like there's times where that happens, and especially with my older kids, in these conversations, it's like show me some appreciation. And they're like, whoa, like, what do you mean? Like, we appreciate you, Dad. But because it's not been shown to me, and I think this is where this consideration of love languages, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't have these conversations, we don't know how to articulate that in our family. Is it, and I didn't even understand it. It's like, what does that mean? Like, what is your love language? Because I know for me, like gifts don't mean anything to me.
Yeah.
But your time does.
Same. Time, acts of service.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Like spend time with me. That, let's go for a walk. Like to me, I love being outdoors, being inside. I dare say confinement is something that I'll never get used to. And I never want to be used to ever again, So I'm uncomfortable in a room. I'm free walking along the beach, walking along a footpath, walking through the bush, walking. That to me is where I'm at the most at peace.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, love is one of those things that, in my heart, I had to fall in love with myself, which is probably, once I really track back and look at my addiction, when I started to really abuse myself as an addict of multiple things, gambling, cocaine, hookers, all comes from this desperate need to be loved. And just this desperation to be, to be nurtured. And that desperation just comes from, I don't want to blame anyone for it. It's just who I am, I just feel like what I missed out became a craving of, and I crave it. I get really hurt by people that don't love me the same way, and it's not their fault because they love differently as well.
Jeremy, you sit before me today as, you're Aboriginal man, grown up in a Māori household, yet you speak so confidently about love languages and how you were never loved. It's very vulnerable things from people who have come from those backgrounds is what I'm trying to portray. But could you take me back to some of your darkest days? Because you touch on it then about the hookers and the gambling. I can't imagine you being at your wit's end or being at your rock bottom. What did that actually look like for you?
The precursor of it all was a compromisation of integrity. I've had this incredibly blessed life, where in the year 2000, I was a didgeridoo player who opened up the Sydney Olympic Games.
Wow, that was you?
Yeah. I'm like, that was September of 2000. In February of 2001, I was given a diplomatic invitation to go to Geneva to address the United Nations on the abuse that we were subjected to while in, state care or different things. I then had a diplomatic passport for 10 years, traveling and educating culturally on every single Australian embassy around the world, I've played in Buckingham Palace twice. I've, played on the lawns of the White House. I've had shows in Las Vegas. Like, I've had this phenomenally blessed life as a result of culture and hard work. Like, obviously doors open, lucky doors open, but you have to be brave enough to put your foot in and then force it open, and, like, hard work, got me to that place. Then in 2012, I realized that I wanted to have more impact here in Australia, on creating a cultural understanding between white and black, because, there's still so much inequality. Poverty exists amongst our people in this country as First Nations people, and nobody calls it poverty. We make it safe by saying low socioeconomic and, no. Like, when there's no running water, that's poverty. When kids can't read and write, that's poverty. It's, let's address it for what it really is. And so I wanted to take my story and use it to be impactful, to create change. And, it just so happened, standing on stage as a keynote speaker, in the audience at one of my very first keynote speeches was Andrew Forrest, the mining magnate from FMG. And Andrew said to me in 2013, I want you to become my spokesperson. And I said, no, I want to become your CEO. And Andrew said, what do you know about being a CEO? I said, nothing. Well, I didn't. I said, fuck all. And he said, I said, but you know a lot. And I said, so teach me, and literally I jumped on a private jet with Andrew that afternoon. And, for the next 3 years, between 2013 and 16, I worked, I became the CEO of his non-for-profit. And it's amazing because everyone was like, wow, look how far you've come from the life that you came from to the life that you're at today. And I had this office on level 32 of Liverpool Street, and I was so lonely. Everything that made me me was my culture, my art, my family. I was in this empty office. And, and then you realize that this quest for success has taken everything that makes you away. And in doing so, I became, incredibly lonely. I started to hate my job. I was in a marriage I hated, and everyone around me is like, why are you so unhappy? Look how much money you're making. Yeah. And everything was about finance. Look, wow, like you're on $250,000 a year or $200,000. I'm like, you could have it all back. Like, have it, take it. Because it was, and in 2016, maybe even 17, I flew up to Garma, which is one of the biggest cultural celebrations that we have in our country, where culture and politics come head to head. It's in August every year, a very powerful time, headed up by the Yothi Yindi Foundation. And so I'm sitting forefront of that, and I'm sitting in bungal, in traditional dance, and then, participating in these cultural celebrations. It was really a reflection to me of who I am, that I am able to navigate these spaces. But in Sydney, I don't have culture. I just have politics and business. And, I became really disheartened. I realized that, far out, I need out of everything I'm involved in. And it was at that point that I lied. I lied to my marriage and said that I had to go away for work. I lied to my boss and said that I had to take care of family business. I literally flew into Sydney and I booked a plane. I had money that I'd hidden in a bank account. It was my GST account. And I walked into the international airport and I was like, Santiago. All right, I'm going there. And then from Santiago, I flew to Lima. From Lima, I flew to Iquitos. And from Iquitos, I jumped on a little tuk-tuk and traveled up the Amazon. I threw all of my possessions into the water. I kept my passport and some money and my didgeridoo. And I get off at the Yagun people there. And for 3 weeks, no English, no Spanish, because they didn't speak English. I didn't speak Spanish. They spoke predominantly their native Yagun. We drew in the sand. If I needed fish, I drew a fish in the sand. It was so beautiful. It was so phenomenally peaceful. And what I did was realize that I needed out. I needed out of a marriage that I was unhappy in. I needed to learn how to be a father, to my kids at a time when it's going to be really tough. And I need to get out of this job. I need to quit. So I quit my job. Like I quit it all. I quit, I threw it all in. But at this time I had to deal with the fact that I was starting to take cocaine on a daily basis because I could afford it. It's a very expensive drug, but I had money, and then in 2017, everything's going bad, starting to go bad. Everything was going great, but it was going bad because my business was growing. I took an advisory role to Andrew, and advising on policy and reform. And that was one of the big things. I quit and resigned from that at that point because I was like, you've taught me everything everything I need to know about business, but I've seen things that I'm not as a man, and that was me taking back parts of my, integrity.
Yeah.
I then took a contract with the federal government around the Royal Commission into all the kids that were abused up through Dondale. And then I was an advisor on the Prison to Work report for the government. It was great money, phenomenal money. I'm making, $17,000, $18,000 a month, but the nightmares started to haunt me of my childhood. And I couldn't ascertain every time I did a face-to-face interview with one of these kids that were helping, I was taking on their story, using my story. And I couldn't discern between their story and my story. And then all of these conversations of abuse, started coming up in my mind, and I wasn't certain, and I couldn't be certain, was this my own abuse? Was this what I was subjected to? I didn't know the answers to any of this stuff, and the nightmares became so violent that I became afraid to sleep. And so therein lies the beginning of what I would call my addiction, because I would do everything possible to keep awake and to stay awake. And, my heart was broken. My spirit was annihilated. My heart was broken. And my between $800 and $1,000 a day cocaine addiction started. It was at a time when I should have been celebrating my success. I was walking away from the confines of corporate Australia, and building a business on my own. I signed a contract with Nestle, and they published all my artwork all over the coffee tins that lined the shelves of Woolworths. And, it made me $150,000 overnight, but all that did was give me more access to the addiction, because I was dying. I was the life of the party dying inside. And I was terrified of being alone. I would always have a hood of people around me. I was supplying the drugs, I was supplying the party, and then when the drugs ran out, they all went home. And yet I was left with my misery. I was left with my broken heart. I was left with my trauma. I was left with my pain, and I was left with my addiction. And this addiction between 2017 and 2019 was the rise and the fall, because I blew every cent that I had. I blew every cent that I would make on cocaine, on gambling, on escorts, desperate to be loved. Because when I was high and gambling, I didn't need to think about the pain of what it was to have no love. Then in this really, bizarre context, what most people don't realize, when I talk about escorts, and it makes people uncomfortable, like prostitution and this conversation about it. And, some people close to me probably get embarrassed, and I don't mean that. But the reality is that maybe of 70% of the escorts that I spent my money on, I never slept with. I just wanted company. I was scared of being alone. And that to me is a really heartbreaking reality. And then probably the biggest precursor of change happened in 2020 was I found myself with like $9,500 left in my bank account, which is still a lot of money. Some people will never know $9,500 in their bank. And I was sitting in Parramatta Children's Court with my son, my second son. And he was facing serious charges. And all of a sudden this realization dawned upon me that being the cool father, out on benders, my son watched me do cocaine. I introduced my kids to that world. and in my addiction made excuses that it wasn't bad. Like, I love my kids, yet I put them in front of that pain. Like, I can't get that back. I can never apologize enough to my children for my two sons. You know, my daughters they were too young, but my sons saw it, you know, and they glamorized it in a way. You know, fuck, dad's hectic. You know, dad will all of his associates and, you know, that looked cool. Fast cars, big money, gambling, pretty girls. It was all a facade. It was all just trying to mask a broken heart. And this addiction had taken everything away from me. And I realized then I spent my last $5,500 on legal fees for my son and went, that's it. I have to fix my life. I have to get sober. If I was a drinker, I wouldn't be here today. I was just fortunate. You know, I had enough insight into the mechanics of who I was at 22 years old when my first son was born to realize that if I don't give up grog, I'll be in jail because I was violent. You know, I love fighting. That was the tragedy of it. I love to fight. I love to protect people. You know, it's my biggest hate in life are bullies, and I become the bully. Mm-hmm. Because when I see someone bullying someone, I bully them.
I was like that on the drink too.
It's disgusting. Yeah. I have a gross tolerance for injustice. And like, why are you taking someone's power away? Mm. So their problem became my problem, but then it became gross problem. Yeah. And so I quit drinking, you know, pretty much. I've probably had, you know, 15 drinks in 23 years. Mm. It's the only reason I'm alive because usually cocaine goes with alcohol, but I didn't. You know, the one thing I realized that if I was on coke, I could drive. Yeah. That's crazy. Mm-hmm. That's a crazy concept. I was like, no, I'm still in control.
And Jeremy, like, I don't know if the wider audience understand how much coke pulses through Sydney, especially corporate Sydney. So
it's disgusting, man.
To do it every day isn't even out of the ordinary.
It's not, you know, and people make, you know, it's like so casually, just like, should we get a bag?
Should we get a bag?
It's like, let's go for lunch and get a bag. I'm like, what the, like now I think back in hindsight, I'm like, what part of our society went wrong when that became the norm? Yeah. You know, where it was like, oh, that's just what you did. You know, and to me, because my addiction was so, you know, I was never buying by the bag. You know, I bought a bare minimum of an 8 ball at a time. An 8 ball, you know, and then it went to, you know, I was buying an ounce, you know, or I'd buy half an ounce here and half an ounce because I knew that I needed to diversify my high, you know, because you get so high on one drug that it wouldn't, no matter how much you had, you couldn't get higher. Mm-hmm. So if you had a mix of it, you know, and I knew everyone. Like it was like this thing that I had this incredible tolerance for cocaine. And my ADHD was more in control when I was high on coke. It was like self-medicating because I could sit still. Mm-hmm. I could have a line and be like, watch a movie now. Yeah, right. Whereas other people want to go and party. I'm like, no, I'm cool now. I'm relaxed. It was like, it really calmed me down, it had the polar opposite. Mm.
It's interesting when you start lowering that bar for yourself. Ugh. Like I know for myself, it was like, oh, suddenly I'm doing coke at 10 a.m. and then 9 a.m. And then, you know, if I'm drinking, I'm like, I can't be fucked having coffee. I'll just have a line of coke. When you keep letting yourself down. And that's what I'm hearing throughout your story is that it's almost like you keep breaking little promises to yourself. You took the job that you probably shouldn't have taken. You married the person that you shouldn't have married. Then you're doing cocaine every day. Yeah. When was the day where you thought, what the fuck am I doing?
Court. Children's court.
Oh, yeah.
The tears ran down my face and something I'd promised my kids. I promised myself that I would never let my kids understand the world that I grew up in of crime, incarceration, violence. And here I am sitting with my son who's like the mirror image of me and he's growing up to be just like me. And all of a sudden I realized this fucking pattern is still there. You know, this growing up to be just like my dad. It's like, and all of a sudden here it goes again. And I was like, no, enough's enough. And literally, very fortunately, he was not incarcerated because he should have been. And he was put on a good behaviour bond and a curfew. And I remember 3 days later hugging my kids and said, no, it's time for me to go. Like, I need to go and get my life back together. And I was really fortunate that, an organisation in Western Australia reached out to me and they were like, oh, we've got a job building a social and emotional wellbeing centre. And so I took that opportunity. I moved up to Kununurra, which is in the remote parts of the Kimberley. And I took that position. Nobody knew me up there. And I could just be me. I wasn't a superstar. I wasn't a famous artist. I wasn't a famous didgeridoo player. I wasn't, a political advisor. I was just me. I was a nobody. I was incredibly overweight at this point. I was like 135 kilos. I was incredibly unhealthy. I was dying. And I took the job because I had access to country. It wasn't my country. It was Mirangadurung country. But I had access to being out on country. And, I went there knowing that there would be no cocaine there. Because if there was cocaine there, I would never have healed this. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like incarceration. I would have never broken free of the shackles of being locked up if I hadn't have gone to far northern Queensland. Mm-hmm. I needed to get the way out of crime because crime finds you if you want it to. Mm. It's almost like we have this pulse that attracts like magnetic fields, like people you can find and navigate your way through an audience of people that have been incarcerated, and you can just find it and you relate to them. It's comfortable, and I needed to get away from a world where cocaine just didn't exist. 2020, February, my last line of cocaine would have been on February the 4th, 2020. The day before I left to Kununurra. Mm. And that was it. I left Kununurra, and all of a sudden had to just be by myself. I went home after work. I was by myself. I didn't know anyone. I just was by myself, me and my thoughts. And I really had started to really unpack, like, who am I? Like, what am I? What is my contribution to the world, Mm-hmm. It was at a time when COVID was sweeping across the East Coast too. So I was watching what was happening on the East Coast. They were all getting locked down. In WA, you had freedom. You could do whatever you wanted. Mm-hmm. As long as you didn't cross that border, you could come back. You couldn't come back if you crossed it. So my intention of just going over there for like 6 months to be with, to get myself together, and it became almost a year and a half, of being in the Kimberley, and I fell in love. I fell in love with myself. And I fell in love with a beautiful woman, I probably would have to say that, she's the reason why I had to fall in love with myself, because in her, and she'll be horrified when she, but she said something to me on the very first night I met her that really confronted me, which was my weight. She's like, she was like, yeah, I would date you if you lost 10 kilos, like in straight up honesty, and I had sort of been lying to I was like, yeah, I still look good. Like you mirror light, like body dysmorphia, right? You become, you're like, no, I'm good. Yet making excuses for the fact that I'm wheezing, I can't breathe, I can't, it's disgusting, and I had to come to terms with that. And, I was like, all right, well, if I'm going to date you, I need to lose 10 kilos. And I literally started walking, and I started thinking about what I put into my body. I started thinking, and, I think it was like 3 months later, we had our first date,
Well,
like a first date. Yeah. And so I lost like 7 kilos, and I remember like pulling her up in the supermarket. I was like 7 kilos down. And I'm like I'm chasing, like, she's 10 years younger, from the community. And I was like, that's it. That became, I'm going to lose 10 kilos, and I lost 10 kilos, and then I lost 10 more kilos, and I lost 10 more kilos to the point, like where I got down to as low as like 102 kilos, like I shed, and it all came from just walking, talking, and this narrative of just healing myself. Yeah. And I love walking because I have my thoughts. It's what I realized, that I process so much of my information of life walking, moving. When I'm still, I actually can't think really clearly. Yeah. And, you know, we left Kununurra together with her 2 kids, with her daughter. And we went to Mount Isa. And then my daughter came to live with us, my 13-year-old. So we had the 2 young teenage girls. And we went, Mount Isa is disgusting. I can't live here. And so we moved to the Gold Coast. And the moment we moved to the Gold Coast, all of a sudden we're in, you know, Vanity City, where everybody is at the gym. Most people have got 3 or 4 gym memberships at different gyms because they need to be seen, you know, but gyms were everywhere. Yeah. And I started training hard out. Like, it's just, to me, was to get fit, to get healthy. And then I realized that, you know, part of this journey of like getting healthy was falling in love with myself again. Yeah. You know, I'm 46. You know, we're not getting any younger. You know, so find the beauty in being 46, not trying to be 30. You know, and it's amazing to me now when I look back on drugs, you know, because I never thought I'd get to a place where I never had a craving for a drug. But I have no craving whatsoever. I know I've seen it been done. I've watched it being done. I've been around it. I've had people say, come on, brother, just have one line. And I'm like, I have no desire. And it purely comes down to the love I have for myself. I think that's what it is. Last year, with 9 other people, but, you know, 9 other Indigenous people, First Nations people, we climbed to base camp, Mount Everest. And like I carried the didgeridoo and there's a lot in that, because I used to, in a really like fucked up way, like call like people up, like on it, you know, I was like come to, I've got an apartment at the Novotel Brighton Sands. I've got a Meriton suite. I was like, fuck, I've got Mount Everest in the room. And like literally I would have an ounce of cocaine tipped on a table. Like so disrespect, so much disrespect for the $8,000 it had cost me. Like, fuck it, who cares? And so going to Everest was about climbing a legitimate mountain and overcoming all of that mental health that had destroyed me. You know, the suicidal ideations, you know, the 2 attempts of suicide, and like real legitimate attempts at just by the hands of God or whatever you want to call it. I don't even, like, I'm not a religious person, but there was something greater power at play that kept me alive. And, you know, thank God for it, because this purpose to save lives and to heal lives and to share my story is an incredible passion, you know, and to touch people's lives with culture is something that I'll never take for granted. Yeah.
When I was up visiting the Glen Rehabilitation Centre, all the First Nations men up there, it was so apparent to me how vital connection to culture, connection to spirituality is for their rehabilitation process. Do you consider yourself spiritual now or connected?
Absolutely. Spiritual. I've always been, you know, and spirituality was the experience of my grandparents, because when I moved to Cape York and to live with them and was sitting with old people, you know, I wasn't I wasn't mixing with anyone my own age. I was sitting with old people. They were talking about spirituality, like cultural spirituality, from this concept of binga, this old people that are always around us, the ancient people are around us, you know, and then you start to experience things that I want to disprove, and you can't. So I became deep, you know, and then, you know, fortunately, even in my speaking career and my, you know, through didgeridoo playing and the teachings of my grandfather around traditional healing, you know, I found myself in, like, you know, all the way back in, you know, 2006, I was in Carlsbad, you know, signing a contract with Hay House, with a publishing company, you know, around using my art. We were going to use my artwork on, you know, totem animal cards and different things. And, you know, I was on, you know, the boat speaking tour with Wayne Dyer. I opened up all the shows for Eckhart Tolle, you know, like spirituality, like in Western New Age world, like but then this interface with cultural people, you know, doing like ceremony, like peyote ceremony with First Nations people in the Americas and up into North America, the ayahuasca and, you know, in the Amazon, the wachuma in the mountains of the Peru. You know, I've always had this very deep affinity to spirituality. Like, it is, I think, a very indigenous thing that will live inside you and lives inside me, and that's our privilege. It's the relationship that we have when we meet as strangers. Our indigeneity meets. Like, I think that's something that we should never take, that can never be taken away from us, despite what separation of culture might do. That spirit lives inside of us. That's what we recognize in other people.
Jeremy, this will be my final question after such a powerful interview. It sounds like you have come home to yourself, truly. It sounds like this loss of identity, the addiction, and coming home to yourself. I envy you with how you sit in being a proud Aboriginal man. What are some tips you can give me or someone else who is really struggling with where they sit in the world or their nationality of how to stand proud?
I can tell you, maybe 2 months ago, I went to Te Whare Aio, which is a beautiful movement, Māori movement. I'll share their link with you. And in that place and that kororo, like that we had, I realized the importance of me nurturing my relationship to Māori culture that I've always had. I also realized the importance of it, that my daughter-in-law is Māori. And all of a sudden this realization that this was always meant to be. My experience as a young person has prepared me for the fact that I potentially will be a grandfather, a kororo of Māori kids, Māori mix. And I want my kids to be staunchly connected to their identity as Gogo Yarangi and as Māori. And that's my privilege as a grandfather we spoke about, that I will be able to love my kids, my grandkids, in a way that I couldn't love my kids. And so I would always say that that as an Indigenous person, it lives and breathes inside of us. We just have to give it access to the oxygen. And the oxygen are the people that will inspire us. That's what will bring it to life. So find the right people that will bring it to life. They don't even actually have to teach you anything. They just inspire that to come to life inside you. They seed its growth.
Thank you so much for coming on Soberly Speaking. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a bit of a selfish episode because I feel like you're my North Star. I feel like you're my guiding light. I feel like it's no coincidence that we have sat here today. And yeah, I'm going to stop this episode before I get emotional. I'm just really grateful for you.
No, thank you so much. Thank you.
Don't, I'm going to cry.
Oh.